Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the financial memorandum for the Right to Addiction Recovery Scotland Bill from Douglas Ross, the member in charge of the bill. He's joined today by Neil Stewart, Senior Clerk, Non-Government Bills Unit. I welcome you both to the meeting and invite Douglas Ross to make a short opening statement. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning to you and to the committee. Can I say it's a real pleasure to be in front of you today, and I hope I'm still saying that at the end of your scrutiny. But for me, it marks another significant step forward from this bill, which I've been working on for some time, and I know your scrutiny will be important, and that of the Lead Committee, the Health Committee, which begins its evidence-taking next week. The latest statistics show that the annual drug deaths continue to rise and have more than doubled in the last 10 years. Scotland's drug death rate is over twice as high as in Wales and almost 3 times higher than England and Northern Ireland. Drug deaths are 15 times more likely to occur in our most deprived areas than our least deprived areas, with Glasgow and Dundee, areas represented by members of this committee, particularly badly affected. However, this is not just an issue with large urban cities. My own area of Moray, despite being relatively small figures, has seen big percentage increases. It was between 2020 and 2021, a 70% increase in drug deaths in Moray represented the highest increase anywhere in the country. And this bill covers not just drug addiction, but alcohol addiction as well. And alcohol-specific deaths are at their highest level since 2008, again the highest anywhere in the United Kingdom, and are 4 times as high in our most deprived areas than in our least deprived communities. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that this is a national scandal. On average, every 4 hours, a Scot will die due to drugs or alcohol. Dies a needless and avoidable death because they were not given the right care and support at the right time. This is a national emergency and deserves to be treated as such. When this Parliament was reconstituted, the late Donald Dewar said it should deliver Scottish solutions to Scottish problems, and I genuinely believe that there can be no better issue for this statement to be made true than the drug and alcohol emergency that we are facing. And I don't say this to make a political point, simply to reinforce to this committee the gravity of the situation and the motivation for bringing forward the Right to Addiction Recovery Bill. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all those who have been involved in the formation of the bill to this point, the Non-Government Bills Unit, who, as a member who has never sought to bring forward a bill before, I had not been closely involved in their work, but they have done a huge amount behind the scenes and to bring us to the point today, and also to frontline experts who have been crucial in forming this bill and getting us to this stage. In particular, I'd like to mention Stephen Wishart and Anne-Marie Ward and Favour UK, who have been real driving forces behind this. Convener, to give a brief overview of the bill, the Right to Addiction Recovery Bill gives every person who's been diagnosed as having a drug or alcohol addiction the right to be informed as to what the appropriate treatment for their addiction is and to be provided with that treatment. The bill sets out a procedure for health professionals to follow in determining treatment, including explaining the treatment options to the patient and encouraging them to participate in the decision-making process as much as possible. It also sets out a process and a right for a second opinion where treatment is deemed inappropriate or where no treatment is deemed appropriate. The bill requires the treatment identified to be made available as soon as reasonably possible and no later than 3 weeks after the determination is made. The bill also requires the Scottish Ministers to publish and lay an annual report on progress made towards providing the treatments for drug and alcohol recovery. Finally, the bill requires Scottish Ministers to prepare a code of practice setting out how the duty to fulfil the right to treatment will be carried out by health boards and others, such as integrated joint boards. I expect, as this is a Finance Committee, much of the questions will be on the financial implications of the bill, and I will not preempt what members may ask, but I will make one point, if I may. The figures included in the financial memorandum represent the best estimate of costs with the available data that we can to come to these conclusions. But as Audit Scotland said in 2022 on their report on alcohol and drug services, it is still difficult to track spending and how it has been distributed and monitored. Alcohol Focus Scotland said in their submission to this committee, "We believe that the financial working that has been done exposes a significant and worrying gap in the available data, And the Cabinet Secretary, in his letter to members of this committee and the Health Committee, said it is extremely challenging to estimate demand and unmet need. So in light of these challenges, I understand the view that these numbers are at the lower end of the expectations, but they are the best figures that can be produced with the data we have at the moment. And as Dame Carol Black said, and I quote, £1 spent on treatment will save £4 from reduced demands on health, prison law, enforcement and emergency services. So yes, there are significant spending commitments with this legislation, but there are also savings to be made. But I think we can all agree that the biggest saving is the lives that will be saved by people getting the help and support that they need when they need it. So to conclude, I know there will be some who are just as passionate about wanting to tackle our shameful drug and alcohol death rate, but disagree with the approach in this bill. To those individuals and organisations, and indeed this committee, I say work with me to get this right. We are at the beginning of the process and there will be time for amendments which I will look at in good faith. But do not let the perfect stand in the way of the good. We cannot miss this opportunity to put the need to take action against this national scandal onto legal footing. It is right that this bill and this issue is given the time to be debated and considered by this committee and this Parliament. I believe people with drug and alcohol dependencies, their families and those who have tragically lost loved ones deserve no less. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much for that helpful opening statement. We will indeed be focusing on the financial rather than policy aspects, but first would like to commend you for the scope and the scale of this bill and the ambitions behind it. I do realise how difficult it is to put together a member's bill on something as challenging as this. And I have to say, having read your financial memorandum again last night, the word challenging it comes up in almost every paragraph, and I think you've kind of alluded to that in your opening statement, be talking about the issues of data, etc. But clearly what we have to do here is look at the financial implications of this bill, and in particular the best estimates that you put forward in your bill, which suggests you know, a low cost of perhaps £28.5 million to just over £38 million a year. And you've talked about how that will also be distributed, and we'll no doubt go into savings at some point. But when we actually look at the submissions that we've received, I think they're all fairly universal in terms of their concern regarding the overall costs. So if we look at in no particular order, except these were the order we were actually presented them with, the Glasgow City Council has said we don't believe the impact of the bill is fully captured within the financial memorandum. The current residential rehabilitation services require significant capital investment to expand existing infrastructure, including in patient detox beds. And I mean, you do go on to the Scottish Government's ambitions to increase beds to 650 next year, so that there is an aspect of that. But they then go on to say that the bill assumes that decisions are made solely by health professionals, which is not the case with Greater Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership. We have wider multidisciplinary team, so therefore costs are significantly underestimated, etc. So I wonder if we can open with that. I think generally speaking from these, and I could quote from North Ayrshire Alcohol and Drug Partnership, Fife Health and Social Care Partnership, but they're all saying much the same thing, that there just seems to be, I take on board what you're saying about available data, but even given that, there seems to be a kind of err on the side of optimism with regard to the costings.
I mean, I think there are two routes to go down. You can use the data that is available, which I accept as the member in charge is not ideal, and that is a view that is shared by many. Or you can look at that data and then add 10%, 20%, 50%. And then I would be coming to this committee struggling to defend that in any way. And I've looked at the scrutiny this committee has made of Members' Bill and government bills. And I think you are right to look for the figures presented by members to be backed up by data. And that's what we've tried to do with this financial memorandum. I've also heard what the committee has said in the past about providing a range, which is why there is a range of lower-end expectations and upper-end expectations. But also, if this bill is passed, by including a proposal for the annual reporting to Parliament, there is an opportunity that going forward we will have better data to inform our decisions. And while I think ultimately this bill is designed to save lives and improve the opportunities for people addicted to drugs and alcohol, there is another benefit in that we will be able to gather better data across the whole of Scotland, and that can inform our decisions and financial decisions going forward. In terms of the impact of the bill that some of the respondents to your call for evidence cited, there was a lot of discussion about wider issues that affect people with addiction being included in this bill, and that was not possible because of it being a non-government bill. It had to be quite narrow in scope, and I think we've done as much as we can with that narrowness, but there are undoubtedly other areas of spend in public life that are affected and are impacted by people being addicted to drugs or alcohol that are not included in this bill. But this bill does not stop that spend. It does not prevent that issue being looked at going forward. On the capital point, I think we do address this in the financial memorandum. The Scottish Government have been very clear that they want to get up to 650 residential rehab beds by March of next year, so in 12 months' time. They believe they're on course to meet that, and I hope they do. So a large proportion of the funding needed to achieve that is already guaranteed by the Scottish Government in previous budgets and in this budget. The 160 million that is there is the baseline, which we're using for our calculations. A large proportion of that will be spent on increasing the number of residential rehab beds, and I think it's important that we recognise that in the financial memorandum. And while we don't separate those capital costs, there is no need to, because that commitment is there from the Government, and they back that up with their funding commitment of 160 million.
I mean, people who have given evidence have suggested, though, that notwithstanding, there is an issue about the requirement for more capital investment, because clearly if this bill goes through and there is a right to recovery, and you've talked about, obviously, and it's in the financial memorandum, publicising that and trying to reduce stigma and getting more people to come forward, then there is a fear that there could be an upsurge in the number of people coming forward, and that even though the Scottish Government is going up to 650 beds, that will not be enough. And we have an issue. I mean, in paragraph 30 of the financial memorandum, there's a talk about the average cost of a placement in a core programme in rehab in Scotland. So it says that's £18,112 a week, but the issue, of course, and this is, I mean, I can understand how difficult it is to put together a financial memorandum when you're looking at this, but it says placement costs range from £6,504 to £27,500 for different varying lengths of courses, from £350 to £5,500 per week. Now, clearly, if there's going to be an upsurge, there'll be extra demand on private places as well, which I take it this bill would expect the Scottish Government to fund. So we could have the Scottish Government funding private places at £5,000 plus per week. So as demand goes up, we could end up with costs rising exponentially because of these kind of issues. So how would you address that particular concern?
Well, first of all, I would say if there is a surge of people coming forward because of awareness around this proposed legislation, and hopefully it becoming law, you'll note in the financial memorandum I encourage, although I don't specify in the bill, but I would encourage the Scottish Government to take part in a publicity campaign to raise awareness of this. I believe that surge will be a good thing. If it is people who need treatment, who need support, who need help and assistance, for them to have the awareness that it will be made available to them, that there is not an option for people to say you can't have that because it's too expensive, and that ultimately saves lives and deals with the shocking number of deaths that we have, then I think that is a good thing. But to come on to your point, Convener, about the varying costs of public and private residential rehab, and it's not just the weekly costs, which you're right to highlight, but the financial memorandum at paragraph 30 also specifies the time that some people spend in residential rehab, that can go from just a few weeks to potentially years in some cases. So we have to look at those significant costs. But we also mentioned in the financial memorandum that there is a tipping point at some stage as more people are being treated as we believe they need to be treated and get that help and support, then it reduces costs elsewhere in the public service. And that's why Dame Carol Black, and I go back to her point, says that for every £1 spent on intervention, we can save £4 elsewhere in the public service. So I think that is important to bear in mind. And also your point about would the government then be using private providers more? Clearly that is an option, and it's up to the government, and we state that very clearly. They then decide how this treatment is delivered. But as the government provides more beds in the NHS, that will hopefully reduce some of the need to go to the private sector, and it will also become more, I don't want to use the word competitive, but there will be more opportunities for people to go to the private sector or to the NHS to get their treatment, and hopefully we can see some of these costs at the higher end stabilise and brought down, and of course people will get the treatment that a medical expert believes they should get. This is not a self-referral process. This is someone who has gone through an assessment with a medical expert, and that medical expert will have decided, or if it's initially refused, a second opinion will have decided that this is the best course of treatment for someone to get over their addiction issues.
I mean, to go to this tipping point issue, you've mentioned it twice, so I suppose I'm going to have to address that now. I mean, COSLA have said in paragraph 14 of their submission, it's not practical nor feasible to assume the organisations we represent will be able to fund the initial predicted uptake in service provision. So, although there might be savings further down the line, and I certainly wouldn't want to dispute that, it's how far down the line these savings are and what resources are available to deliver the bill. Because I think when a bill of this importance, I would suggest, in magnitude, has to work from the day it's launched. What we don't want is people turning up for services where there's not the facilities that are required, where there's not the staff trained and the support available. So COSLA have said that the spend to save models outlined does not truly reflect the ongoing lifelong model of care needed for patients who present through ADPs. Therefore, costs do not accurately reflect the delivery of care in reality. So although there may be some savings, they are effectively suggesting they don't necessarily agree with what Ms Black has actually said. They also go on to say that it's difficult to quantify the estimated costs and savings for local authorities given the lack of consideration for the essential direct and indirect services provided by local authorities to the benefit of ADPs throughout the FM. So COSLA are obviously concerned that this has been weighted very heavily in terms of health boards, but what they're saying is that even if there are savings down the line, they don't necessarily agree that they will be quite as high as is perhaps being suggested. But there is the initial cost, which we obviously as a committee have to, and the government would have to address.
I think, first of all, on COSLA's concerns, I don't dismiss them in any way. Local authorities across the country, as we have seen, are dealing with significant financial challenges, and funding going into a number of these areas has been stretched and in some cases reduced over many years. That, I believe, is slightly different to this bill. This bill is looking at a right to addiction recovery, looking at the models through NHS, through integrated joint boards and through local authorities, but ultimately that will be down to the Scottish Government to decide how that funding is distributed going forward. And of course, even without this bill, if it doesn't pass into law, these challenges that COSLA have identified in their submission will still exist. People will still need the support that they are suggesting there is not the sufficient funding for. So it does go back to a wider question for the government, for this committee and for this Parliament about funding for local government more generally. And I just think it's important to recognise that this bill does not seek to replace any other forms of treatment or support. That will still continue, and rightly so. It is just ensuring that there is legal footing where people are given a treatment option such as rehabilitation recovery, that they have the guarantee in law that that can and will be provided.
I mean, you obviously represent a rural region in terms of Highlands and Islands. One of the concerns that's been brought is how do we ensure that we are able to provide an equitable service? I mean, I obviously have rural areas in my constituency and most members around the table, I think with the exception of John really, possibly Michelle do. But certainly that's a real issue for many of us and for many communities. So how would you ensure that a bill like this is delivered is equitably, and from Stranraer to Shetland? Yeah,
and I think it was Aberdeen ADP that made that point very clearly.
Yes, they did,
in their submission to your committee. And I think it's crucial, as you said, Convener, I represent probably one of the most rural areas. Highlands and Islands is 44% of the landmass in Scotland, going from Shetland down to Argyll and Bute. And I am absolutely determined that this bill can have the same impact on people living in our more remote and rural areas and our island communities as those in our more urban, bigger cities. We're very clear in the financial memorandum. If we look at paragraphs 70 through to 76, we look at making sure that this is a universal provision. We want to ensure that it is promoted accordingly. We set out in some detail how the bill could affect island communities and some of the issues that affect smaller communities, getting the second opinion, ensuring that those who are making the assessment in the first place have the relevant training to do so. That's why we've included in the bill the £200,000 cost initially for training people who will be making these assessments, and then hopefully the ongoing training for NHS staff and others will be included going forward when hopefully this bill becomes law. Then we will have that training throughout urban and rural communities, and the offer is there for people to get the treatment that they want and deserve.
And do you feel that the financial memorandum reflects that? Because the evidence we're suggesting says it doesn't. There's an issue about finding the people to do this work. It's one thing, say, the Scottish Government, assuming it had unlimited resources in terms of cash, still has to find the people and have the people trained to the required standard to deliver the kind of outcomes that we seek. Because one of the things you've said again in your financial memorandum in 85, you've said that the implementation of the bill will lead to more completed treatments, and in turn fewer repeat appointments being needed for patients seeking a new treatment having had an unsuccessful patient journey. But I'm not sure where the evidence comes from that. I mean, if we're going to have a significant increase in staff numbers across Scotland who won't have the same experience as some of the organisations that have been working in this field for years, even decades, but you're suggesting that it will lead to better outcomes, but I'm not really sure where the evidence is that it will do that when we'll get people who won't have the same level of experience, etc.
Well, what we've, again, I go back to the initial costs that we've put in the financial memorandum of the £200,000 of additional training. We've looked at other pieces of legislation that this Parliament has passed and taken that figure from there. But in terms of this universal service, I think it is absolutely crucial that someone in the islands can get that initial training to be able to make these assessments, and then that assessment can then become the treatment option for the patient, and that can be brought forward. In terms of staffing, I mean, we could look at the wider issue of recruiting people to island communities to serve there. I certainly know in the Highlands and Islands a number of people that come up from more urban communities with their experience to change their lifestyle. So we do draw people from all over Scotland and indeed the United Kingdom to some of our more remote and rural locations, and they can bring that experience up with them. But I think we have tried to inform the financial memorandum by putting in those training costs up front. And in terms of the evidence of how this will make savings going forward, that's from the frontline experts who have been crucial in informing this bill, who have told us if people can get the treatment they need when they need it and can deal with their addiction issue at that point, it will undoubtedly save repeat returns to GP, to other medical services, because the problem will hopefully have been dealt with in the initial phase rather than getting worse and more complex and requiring repeat visits to GP practices and other professionals.
One could say exactly the same of the current service delivery, if they're treated effectively, blah, blah, blah. It's about how this bill is going to make the difference. I mean, one of the things that Fife has said is that they're concerned at the omission of support costs in the financial memorandum. So they've said the costs of complementary support to sustain long-term recovery, including psychological therapy, psychosocial support and community and residential rehabilitation that may be a benefit to those requesting treatment, is not reflected in the financial memorandum.
Again, these are ongoing costs that will occur regardless of this bill being passed or not.
But you get more people. If you get more people receiving treatment, then clearly the kind of level of support that's required for these people is also going to rise. Surely, is it not?
Well, again, going back to the Cabinet Secretary's letter about hidden demand, it is hidden in such a way that they're not getting the treatment, but the demand is still there. These people are still in our communities suffering from drug and alcohol addiction, and they are accessing some services. They're not accessing all services or potentially for them the right services, but they need to get the help and support. Some of that will come through this bill if it becomes law, but some of it is also already being delivered and will continue to have to be delivered going forward.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you've talked about it being hidden, actually, the level, and in chat we've talked about, you know, some 22% of adults having alcohol problems, but the bill is only really going to apply to those who have been diagnosed with an alcohol problem. Now, in terms of drugs, you've said in paragraph 23 of the financial memorandum that the number of individuals with problem drug use in Scotland is 57,300. But the number of people who've actually had initial assessments in terms of specialist drug treatment has varied from, you know, 6,275 to 7,867 in recent years. So the untapped demand is really huge. And we talked earlier on about the kind of cost of treatments averaging some £18,000 per person. So if we take even a small proportion of these 50,000 people that have been identified as being drug addicts, undoubtedly more that we don't know about, you know, you don't have to be an arithmetic genius to realise that the £28 to £38 million spelled out in the financial memorandum is going to be breached pretty early on just from drugs, let alone alcohol.
Well, again, and you'll know this, convener, the 28.5 to £38 million is the additional cost. You know, there is that's on the baseline of £160 million, so it's taking the total budget up to £198 million.
Indeed, but that 160 million is dealing with the 7,000 odd people we already that come forward for treatment, not of whom take up the treatment, because there's about a third of them don't go forward with that, and those taking alcohol services. So if you're talking about increasing the budget, say 160 to 198 million, as is suggested in the memorandum, but the number of people just on drugs doubles from over 7,000 to 15,000, you could be, you know, you're going to blow that 198 million pretty quickly. Assuming you've got all the staff and facilities, etc., already in place.
But there will be different forms of treatment for different people. For some, rehab is the right approach, and you know we rely heavily on that in this legislation, because you know we've seen what many of the organisations speak about the benefits of that. Favour UK said quality residential treatment can help improve mental and physical health, reduce offending, improve employability and enhance social functioning. So for some that will be absolutely the right approach to take. For others there are a variety of treatment options that will be right for them. And yes, we will see an increase in the number of people being treated and supported with this legislation. But it is very difficult. Again, I would be coming here, convener, picking a figure out of thin air if I tried to provide alternative figures which are not backed up with the data. And that's the difficulty. And I get what you're saying, that if you take the 57,300 and then you look at the wider number of people that will be requiring treatment, you know, the cost, as I said in my opening remarks, maybe is at the lower end of expectations. But it's very difficult, and I think it's telling as well that the Scottish Government, in their response to this bill, didn't provide an alternative level of funding that they think would be required. I know they've done it with other bills, but they also couldn't come up with a figure to suggest what the bill would cost.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying there, but I mean, the point I've tried to make is that even if we take on board what you're saying in terms of the data, there are still extraneous costs that just don't seem to be included, like capital and the stuff I've already mentioned, such as complementary and ongoing support. Now, just one last thing, because I've got colleagues who are keen to come in as well. What CAUS have said in paragraph 30 of their submission is that it should also be noted that employers' national insurance contributions are also a significant pressing risk for local government, commission services and other public and third sector bodies. Council would not be able to meet additional costs if the RISE is not fully funded, would be forced to make difficult decisions, as would IGBs and EDPs. Now, we're talking a significant cost here. If you look at where do you feel that this can be found within the Scottish Government's budget? Because, you know, we've just passed a budget, and there's ongoing and increasing demands and challenges throughout this year. It looks like employer national insurance contributions increases are here to stay. So there'll be an ongoing cost for local authorities and the public sector, etc., and indeed the third sector, which is under the cost, as you know. So I'm just wondering where you feel the money for this bill within the Scottish budget should come from.
Well, first of all, on employer national insurance contributions, this bill was lodged long before the decision was taken by the new UK government, and I think the Scottish Government have been right to seek as much financial recompense for services here in Scotland for that, and we are seeing it as going to be a huge challenge for public bodies such as the government, for councils and charities, and that has been well rehearsed in this Parliament and by this committee, and something that I agree with. In terms of where do we find the funding for this, at the upper end of the estimations, this bill would cost £198 million annually out of a budget for the Scottish Government of just shy, I think, of £64 billion. So I believe there will be savings within that budget that can be found. In a previous role in this Parliament as a party leader, I would quite often come up with suggestions, not all that would have met favour with people around this room, about how you would find those savings.
Not as many suggestions as for additional funding that we actually hear from your colleagues in every debate.
That is true, in the same way it is sometimes when your own party are in opposition in different parliaments in this United Kingdom, and the same charge could be made against them. But I say on a serious point that this is a significant budget, but out of an entire budget of £64 billion, I believe the funding can and should be found for something that I think most of us, if not all of us, agree is a national emergency.
Okay, with that, we shall move on round the table, and the first colleague to ask questions will be Liz, to be followed by Ross.
Good morning. Just before I ask my main questions, Mr Ross, could you identify within the first question that the convener asked you about data, do you have any evidence that because your bill is in existence, that the availability of data is improving? By no means is it complete, as you've obviously rightly said, and as somebody who's obviously got a member's bill in Parliament just now, which had an absence of data to work with. Do you have any evidence that because you are addressing these issues in your own bill, that there is evidence to support the fact that we are getting better data?
Well, yes, I think we are. It's taking too long. The debate data is clearly still not complete. And as I mentioned to the convener, the annual reporting to Parliament will improve that data, I think, significantly. The government will then be duty-bound to have to put that into a statement to Parliament and be held accountable to that. They will then have to work with integrated joint boards, with health boards and with others to get that data. But clearly, I have to say, and I make this point very sincerely, I've had constructive meetings with a number of drugs ministers in the time, with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and indeed with the First Minister. I had a joint meeting with the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary about autumn time last year, and I think there was an agreement at that meeting that this was something that we need to focus on, but we also need to improve the data going forward. So when I get that reassurance from the top of government, I think that's something that is encouraging and potentially has been facilitated by this bill. Right,
that sounds very positive. Can I just come to the fact the convener asked you from your opening remarks about the comments that Dame Carol Black had made in terms of the fact that, for every pound that is put in, you perhaps get a £4 return on the spending in justice or in health, etc. And that's obviously encouraging. Can I just come to paragraph 94 of your financial memorandum, where it's referencing a Public Health Scotland figure of £3.5 billion from 2009 for the cost of illicit drug use. And that's 2009 is obviously when drug use was less, sadly, than it is today, when it's much higher, and therefore the costs are going to be high. Do you consider that the savings could be much higher as a result of that?
And just on that £3.5 billion figure, when we adjust it for inflation, it takes it up to £4.3 billion. But yes, I do believe the savings could be significantly higher. Again, I mean, some people may question Dame Carol Black. I thought the report she did for the UK government was extremely comprehensive, and this point it has been used by a number of charities and governments, indeed, to encourage more intervention at an earlier stage and the appropriate intervention, and by spending a little at the moment, it can make significant savings going forward. forward. That £1 of intervention for £4 in savings, I think, could even be higher now from Dame Carol Black's initial report. And that's why a number of organisations continue to cite that, because this early intervention, this treatment-focused, personalised approach can make a huge difference.
And would it be possible to break that down anyway between health and justice brief, or was that just an overall?
I mean, it was an overall figure. Perhaps it's something we can look at with parliamentary questions. I'd be quite keen to lodge some parliamentary questions to get more information if possible. This obviously wasn't looking at Scotland in particular. This was a report done for the UK government, but I think people can see that the benefits, financial, well above the 1 to 4 ratio, but also the personal benefits of lives being saved is perhaps the most crucial here as well.
From what you've said in the Chamber, Mr Ross, you've put it to the Parliament several times that this bill is designed specifically to complement rather than to replace the other the sort of other policies that are designed to improve treatment. Do you have any way of being able to ascertain how well that might all come together if your bill is to pass? I mean, are we going to see a reduction in some of these other things, or that would be in addition to?
I think it's a very good point, and I want to continue to stress, and will throughout the process of this bill, that this is not superseding any other forms of support or seeking to replace any other forms of support. It is to complement that support. We look in the financial memorandum about the number of people that are suggested for residential rehab and certain treatments who do not complete that treatment. And it's that cohort of people who experts have determined it is the right approach for them, but for reasons of time or cost, or for a multiple of reasons that we don't yet know about, people do not complete the full treatment that is suggested for them. We want to give people the legal footing to have that guarantee backed by law passed in this Parliament, that where they are told that treatment will help them with their addiction problems for drugs or alcohol, they will get that. It doesn't stop people getting other forms of help, support and treatment. It does, as you say, complements what's already in existence.
Thank you, that's helpful. I mean, you mentioned that the Scottish Government has committed to a certain number of beds, and that's good, and you've got every expectation that that's going to happen. Do you think that when it comes to the capacity being resolved, do you think there will be considerable scope for cost reduction there?
Yeah, I mean, the commitment to 650 beds by March of next year is one, certainly when I've challenged Neil Gray in the Chamber, he believes he's on course to meet that, and I want him to. You know, this is not a political point where sometimes the failure of government can be seized upon by opponents. This is one I think we all want the government to deliver and achieve. And I think, you know, if that can happen by March of next year, what we propose in the bill can then ensure that people get that treatment, and there will be opportunities elsewhere to look at savings going forward. Because I think as more people get the treatment when they need it, their issue can be dealt with at the time, rather than perhaps getting more complex and chronic going forward, and then the intervention at a later stage is far more costly to the government.
And my final point is just on the sort of collaboration. You've obviously had good collaboration from the Scottish Government and from other political parties, as far as I can make out. And although obviously the people who've written into this committee are raising various challenges and saying that, you know, there's been an underestimate of the costs, etc., fairly common for a financial memorandum, it has to be said. Do you feel that there is really good quality collaboration across the sectors that would have to address this?
Yes and no, if I'm honest. I think if anyone has met with organisations dealing with addiction, they will find some very split opinions. Some people believe residential rehab is the right and only approach. Others believe it is not. And therefore, I understand why there will be conflicting views on this. You know, not everyone working in this sector will agree with the approach of this bill. And that's why I reiterate the point that this bill does not replace other mechanisms or other opportunities to help and support people. It hopefully complements it, because the people who will be entitled to residential rehab and other forms of treatment identified in the bill will be ones who need it, who a medical expert has determined that is the right approach for them. But crucially, what this bill will do will ensure it cannot be refused for any reason. It will happen within 3 weeks of that determination being made. At the very most, we'd hope far sooner. But given that legal guarantee to get the treatment that is determined right for that individual, and that individual to feel part of it, I think is crucial.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ross, followed by John.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I entirely accept that it's impossible to completely accurately estimate the costs of this, given the stigma around addiction. That being said, I'd like to pick up on just one specific area where some of the concerns have been raised around social work costs. Am I right in understanding that the financial memorandum doesn't take account of any increased social work costs related to this?
The increased costs in the bill, we're clear, go to the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government make the funding decisions. So we are not limiting them to just putting money into ADPs or to health boards. And therefore, the money that the Scottish Government currently provide to ADPs or through ADPs goes through councils, and therefore there is opportunities for councils to spend and to receive a greater proportion of funding if the Scottish Government believe that's the best way to deliver this going forward. We've tried to keep it as open as possible, so we are not limiting the Scottish Government's ability to deliver the objectives of this bill.
So, yes, I understand in terms of delivery mechanism, but if we're trying to get an accurate understanding of, how, for example, how much it costs at present per individual, surely it would be crucial to take into account the associated social work costs. And I understand that there's a bit of a data availability issue there, because a lot of this doesn't go through DAISY, but I would presume to at least some extent councils would be able to at least provide something via freedom of information request. I think it's quite a substantial additional area of cost to not see reflected in the bill, so it makes it quite hard to get an understanding of what the cost per individual is likely to be.
I know East Ayrshire Alcohol and Drug Partnership mentioned the fact that we were focusing an awful lot on the DAISY data for our financial memorandum, but I think it was important that we looked at that as a set of figures and data points that we could then translate into the financial memorandum. I take on board your point about local authorities. We have tried to get as much data as possible. I obviously went out and we spoke to a number of different health boards in the formation of the financial memorandum. I'm very keen to open up that discussion further with local authorities about social care, social work costs, if that would be helpful, and I think it probably would be. But I would also go back to the point I made to the convener. These costs currently exist and will continue to exist if this bill passes or if it does not.
I appreciate that. I think that the potential, though, is for the cost to increase, because even just through the publicity of this bill, we would all hope, I think, that more people would come forward to have an addiction that already exists diagnosed and therefore to access support. Can I just clarify, though, as it stands at the moment, do you have any data on associated social work costs from local authorities?
No, the research we did was through health boards and ADPs, so some of that figures and data will be fed in through the ADPs and the integrated joint boards, which obviously have council representatives on it. But it is something I'm happy to go away after this discussion to try and get some of those figures, because I think it would be helpful for yourself and other members.
That'd be useful. Thanks very much. That's all from me, Convener.
Thanks, Ross. John, to follow Craig.
Thanks, Convener. Could you just maybe talk us through some of the figures, the percentages, which I find interesting, but I'm not sure I've fully got my head round. It talks in, I think it's paragraph 54 of the financial memorandum, about 31% of referrals were discharged before starting treatment. Of these, 79% were discharged and recorded as treatment incomplete, and various reasons for that. And you're hoping, as I understand it, to dig into that remaining, so that's 24%, of all treatment referrals, and you're hoping to cut that 24% down. Is that broadly where we're going?
Yes, to get 50% to 2/3% of those coming forward for treatments and completing those treatments. Again, it goes back to a point that I think this committee has rightly asked for before. We didn't want to just pick one 50% increase. We thought putting in a range would be more helpful to this committee in considering the projected costs of both a lower end and an upper end.
And is that 50% to 66%? Is that? I mean, is that just what we'd like to do, or is there some kind of? Do people think that could happen?
Well, we felt it was, an accurate assessment of roughly where we could get to. You're not going to get 100% of these people who didn't complete their treatments. Therefore, 50% would be not an insignificant increase, but if we get up to 2/3, that is a larger proportion of people who haven't completed the treatments in the past. By having it enshrined in law, they could and should be able to do so, and by doing this person-centred approach, hopefully they will be more encouraged to do that and continue that discussion about their treatment options going forward. So it was to provide that range of opportunities for people who are currently not completing the treatment that other experts have deemed as appropriate for them.
And I mean, is this another area we just don't really have the data on? Because I mean, addiction, in my limited experience, it's a really powerful hold on people. And so some people, today they might say, yeah, I'd like to get off drugs, but the grip on them is so strong that they're not going to continue the treatment.
But that is a crucial point, because that's why the treatment, and we put in here, it must begin within 3 weeks, but we would like it far sooner. We put in the 3-week period because that's obviously a figure used by government at the moment, and 95% of people should be getting that treatment within the 3 weeks already. Indeed, that's what the government are. We mentioned that at paragraph 66, that 95% of referrals resulted in treatment starting within 3 weeks or less. The longer that period goes on, the more chance there is that someone becomes disenfranchised from the proposal and their treatment option that has been determined for them. So we want this bill and the publicity surrounding this bill to give people the confidence that when they get that medical assessment of their need, that they can get that as quickly as possible to save them, changing their circumstances, which would lead to them not completing their treatment.
I mean, you said in an answer to the convener that people should not be told that they can't have treatment because of the cost. But I mean, is that not just life? That we can't have more roads because of the cost. We can't have more houses because of the cost. We've got waiting lists in the NHS because of the cost. I mean, we are limited as a nation, as individuals, by how much money we've got. So, I mean, surely there has to come a time when you say to people, yes, you need a hip replacement, yes, you need this, but there just isn't the money for it.
Well, I disagree with that. When it's something as serious and as crucial as this, as I mentioned earlier, the Scottish budget is annually about £64 billion. I'm asking us to spend less than £200 million a year on supporting people with addiction problems. And I think given what people with addiction have suffered and continue to suffer, going back to Mr Greer's point about stigma and the impact it has not just on them and their family, I think this is money well spent if people can get over their addiction. And remember, this is people who want to. They want to get better. They have struggled and suffered for far too long, and they have gone seeking help and support. And I have got countless testimonies of people who were told that residential rehab was right for them, that other forms of treatment was correct for them, and they couldn't get it, either because of cost or for availability reasons. And I don't think in 2025 here in Scotland we should be having anyone that cannot get the help and support they need to get off of their addiction and turn their lives around, because we know from people who have gone through the process successfully and have turned their lives around that they make an amazing impact on our community and society here in Scotland.
I mean, I accept that out of the total Scottish budget this is not a huge amount, but unfortunately that gets said about a lot of things, and our colleague Liz Smith is wanting to have children going to outdoor centres, which again I think is an extremely good idea, but again would just cost another 30 or 40 million. And they all add up, and somehow we have to prioritise within this. And I mean, is it your argument that this, I mean, assuming that this 38 million would come out of the health budget, you know, is it your argument that this should be more of a priority, say, than people waiting for hip replacements? So if people were to wait a bit longer for hip replacements, that would be okay because we'd be putting the money into this?
Well, I'm saying that the money should come out of the wider Scottish Government budget, and I think we could spend all morning discussing where that could come from, and my priorities would undoubtedly be different from your priorities, Mr Mason. But I think it is important that this is a group of people who have not felt the support of this Parliament or multiple governments for far too long. How often have we stood up annually when we get the figures and said this is Scotland's national shame and something must be done about it, and nothing ever changes? The only thing that changes is the figures get worse and worse and worse. We sometimes get a slight dip and then the numbers go back up again. We cannot continue to do the same time and time again and expect different results, which is why I think putting this into law, giving people that reassurance that the treatment that is deemed right for them will be provided to them, it will be helpful not just to the individuals but to Scotland, who I think as a country we are shamed by our annual figure showing how many of our fellow Scots are dying needlessly from drugs and alcohol every year.
I mean, I'm agreeing with all of that, and I'm sure the lead committee is looking at that specifically, but I mean, we're looking at the money. I mean, well, you've said I'll disagree with your suggestion, but let's hear your suggestion as to where the 38 million comes from.
Well, again, we could go on, as I did in a previous role, about savings that the government could make with major projects. So we could discuss ferries. We could discuss back in 2016 the money wasted on the IT system for farm payments. We could discuss.
Given that that's money,
I don't really want to get into that.
Well, give me a suggestion point. Going forward for the future. We've wasted the money in the ferries. We've wasted the money in the IT. Where in next year's budget would we get this money from?
Well, again, there are opportunities in a £64 billion budget to find these savings. If you would like me to go away and research, because I don't want to give you a figure and say this would save half of the £38 million, and that figure is wrong, because knowing your background as an accountant, Mr Mason, you will have the figures at your fingertips. I do not, but I am quite happy to write to you, Mr Mason, after this meeting with £38 million of savings in the current budget, and we can scrutinise that going forward. I'm saying they will be my savings, they may not be my party colleagues, Ms Smith or Mr Hoy's savings, but if you are asking me to find £38 million in the budget to save, I will find that for you.
Okay, I look forward to that. I mean, I would just raise tax and pay for it that way, but you might not want
Again,
to do that.
That will not be on my letter.
Okay, fair enough.
I can give you that assurance.
Still on the money, the £1 that we've spent today could save £4 in the future. I mean, the suggestion has been made that really it wouldn't be a saving because there's so much pressure in the system, both justice and health, that it would just relieve some of that pressure. So, in fact, there would not be any saving.
But that in itself is a saving because it is relieving that pressure. These budgets are, as you say, extremely tight. We've had those discussions in this Parliament about that on a number of occasions. But the point is, with that early intervention, you are making savings going forward. And no one has been able to prove to me that Dame Carol Black is wrong with her assumption that spending £1 in intervention for addiction issues and drug problems, it will not make these savings to the wider public service.
Okay, I mean, I don't think we'll see the money coming back, but I take your point that it would relieve the pressure. And probably, I think my final point, I mean, you're wanting this in law. Now, it does seem to become a kind of habit of both the government and others to put things into law and then not meet them. So what happens if we put this into law and the targets don't get met? Does a government minister go to prison, or what happens?
Well, I think that's a very good point, and it was one of the questions I got quite a lot when the bill was formally launched in May of last year, that we already have targets, for example, on cancer treatment times, and if we don't meet them, what does that mean? I think the annual reporting to Parliament puts more onus on ministers. They have to be accountable. They have to be accountable to this chamber and to representatives, and therefore it will be for members of the next Parliament, whoever that should be, if this bill goes through, to hold government ministers to account. And some, depending on who's in government and who's in opposition, may demand that people resign over this. I'm not saying that in any way. I'm saying we have put in the bill an opportunity for Parliament to be able to scrutinise delivery against the aims of this bill, and I think that's an important role for Parliament going forward.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Ross. A fair few of the questions that I might have dwelt upon have already been asked, just perhaps to help Mr Mason out a little bit in terms of the cost. To take on the alcohol side of the equation, the alcohol and drinks industry is obviously already committed to significant expenditure in relation to combating alcohol harm, community alcohol partnerships, the money they put into self-regulation, so on and so forth. Have you had any discussions with the alcohol industry about how money that is already spent could be repurposed for such a programme, or how, for example, some of the revenues from minimum unit pricing, which is approximately £32 million a year according to Fraser Valander, could be used in some way to meet some of the costs that are contained within what I think is a worthwhile bill?
Yeah, and this has been discussed at some of the CPGs within this Parliament, which I've attended on drugs and alcohol addiction. There is certainly opportunities in funding that has become available and continues to become available to direct at priorities contained within this proposed legislation. I think the industry at sometimes is criticised for not doing enough, but I think it seeks to put funding where it can tackle issues of problem drinking and addiction. I know that from my work with the Scottish Whisky Association and the CPG on Scottish Whisky, as you do, I think, Mr Hoy, for the cross-party group on beer and pubs, that this is something that the sector is very aware of and seeks to direct available resources to a number of projects to not only stop people becoming addicted in the first place, but to help people who are suffering from addiction.
The financial memorandum anticipates significant savings in the long term. I think the £1 and £4 contrast is probably, I mean, if you think about it, in terms of social harms, family breakdown, loss of employment, you go right through the range. I think that certainly looks to me to be a pretty decent equation. But obviously that will come in the long term. Have you got any assessment as to what the long-term horizon is? Is it 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years?
It is very difficult, and it's the tipping point issue that I mentioned to the convener a couple of times. When that tipping point occurs will be determined by a number of different factors. Go back to Mr Mason's point about how many of the 26% or whatever figure we were looking at there come forward at a given time. What I think is important is that from day one, again, another member said that this bill is ready to work. This bill provides the support and assistance that people need immediately. That's why the increase in the number of residential rehab beds is crucial, and the government meeting that target next year will be likewise very indicative of how we will perform in this area. But to pick a date when I think the short-term benefits become long-term savings, I think is very difficult to do at this point.
I think you said in your opening remarks that this bill would have a significant impact on those living in Scotland's most deprived communities, who are more likely to die from drugs and alcohol misuse. So obviously there's a lot of government funding focused on ending deprivation, child deprivation. We know that it's all inextricably linked. So is it fair to say that this expenditure will yield the greatest improvement in quality of life for those deprived communities who in many respects still do fall through the cracks?
Yes, I do believe we can say that with some certainty. As I said in my opening statement, the drug deaths are 15 times higher in our most deprived areas than our least deprived areas, and alcohol deaths are almost 4 times higher in our least deprived areas, our most deprived areas than our least deprived areas. So these are communities that this legislation will make the biggest impact in. This is the hard to reach areas, the unmet demand that we've spoken about, that untapped demand, where people, I hope, will come forward to get the help and support that they need, because we can see these are the communities that are currently suffering the most from drugs and alcohol, and therefore they are the communities that can benefit the most from this legislation.
And regardless of what happens next in terms of parliamentary time or government support for the bill, obviously it has raised awareness of the need for rehab and also the scale of Scotland's alcohol and drug deaths. It's also led to more data and transparency around that data. How much further do you think we have to go before we've got a really accurate picture in terms of the trends and the costs. I know that some of them will always be unknown, but it's one of the unintended consequences of the legislation that we are starting to compile that data, and that is useful in public policy terms more generally.
Yes, absolutely. I think, as I said, ultimately the main aim of the bill is to save lives, but if we can better inform our decisions for the government, for the Parliament, by having improved data, then I think that will also be a benefit of this legislation. I think that's why the reporting to Parliament and the proposals included within the bill and the costs associated with that in the financial memorandum are important to improve that data set going forward. And in terms of raising awareness, then yes, this bill has continued to shine the light on the appalling tragedies that we see in Scotland every year from drug and alcohol deaths, and I think we should continue to do that, both during the process of this bill and until we get these figures down. The fact that we are still not just the worst in the United Kingdom for drug and alcohol deaths, but the worst of many countries across Europe, and in drug deaths certainly the worst across Europe. This shows us this is a problem that we have to tackle. It should have been tackled some time ago, in my view, but we are where we are now, and in 2025 I think we can send a very strong signal by passing this legislation, putting this into law, and start saving lives with people getting the treatment that is right for them.
And in the short to medium term, until the bill passed and then was introduced in terms of actually getting the systems in place, do you think that this also makes it easier for, or more, actually, let's rephrase it, more difficult for the Scottish Government to cut budgets as they've done in the past, because there is this increased focus?
I think that's an important point. The National Mission completes next year. So at the moment, the money associated with the National Mission is not guaranteed going forward. I think it must. I think we need significant levels of funding going forward. But by putting this bill into law, in this session of Parliament, we will be guaranteeing that funding going forward. And I think that will be an extremely important signal to people with addiction issues out there that the funding is backed up by this Parliament. But it is also an important message to government that this continues to be a priority for members across this Parliament, because it's something that I hope I've not strayed too much into the political territory today, because there is very good cross-party support on this bill from members of the governing party and opposition members who want to see our appalling drug and alcohol death rates reduce, who want to see people surviving from their addictions and getting the help and support they need. By putting this into law, we're also guaranteeing that funding going forward into the next Parliament and beyond, which I think will be crucial as the National Mission, which is currently scheduled to finish next year, comes to a close, and the Government look at further opportunities to deal with this issue.
And just finally, to close on just the problem of alcohol misuse. In their submission, SHAP has called for a new robust national needs assessment to be carried out, followed by a full calculation of the cost estimates of upscaling provision to meet currently unmet need in relation to alcohol dependence. Are you sensing that there's any agreement to extend the scope of the bill for all people with alcohol use disorder, as SHAP has suggested, or would you want to look at that further down the line?
So I can't do that with this. As I said to the convener, that the non-government bills are sometimes quite narrow in focus and have to be. There are issues that we've not touched yet, and we probably will more with the lead committee around housing and homelessness and such like, which are very often associated with addiction issues that we can't get into with this type of legislation, despite many of the frontline experts being keen that we could. So I don't think we can extend the scope of the bill. It will be for others to look at that, and I would encourage them to do so. But also, this is looking at people who are diagnosed with an addiction. Now, I understand that is not everyone who suffers from alcohol misuse, but by having that diagnosis of addiction, we can then get the medical intervention if required and the treatment needed to deal with that addiction, which is why that's stipulated so clearly in the bill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michelle.
Hi, thank you very much. You've given a lot of information so far. In reading through the FM, I was very struck by the number of very detailed points outlining the basis and the provisions by which the estimates were arrived. And that suggested to me that a lot of careful thought had been given into that. It also suggested to me, given that there's 95 clarifying points, that the confidence level on the figures, or the figure of 198 million, has to be relatively low, and with good reason and with every justification. So given that, it's a question I often ask in this committee: how confident are you, and maybe even your supporting civil servant, on a scale of 0 to 10, whereas 0 is no confidence and 10 is 100% confidence, what mark would you give it? Because with 95 clarifying points, I think the only thing we can be certain of is 198 million is not accurate.
Well, I would also say, 160 million of the current budget is not enough, which is why I'm asking for us to spend more money on this. I will go back to this point. I could have picked a figure wildly different from the 198 million that we get to with the increase required for this bill, and not be able to give you an accurate figure on your scale of 0 to 10 either.
And I'm not asking you for an accurate figure on my scale of 10. My question specifically was, how confident are you that 198 million is accurate? That was my question.
Well, it's accurate in terms of the data we have in front of us. So I give it a 10 on accuracy for what we have. If your question is, do I think £198 million is what this will cost every year? No. I can't give that commitment, because the figures and the range that we have had to include in this vary significantly. And ultimately, it potentially can be put as a failure for me if this ends up costing more money. But if that is because more people have the confidence to come forward and seek the treatment that they want and need, then I will accept that criticism, because more people will be helped as a result of this.
And that, in that respect, is the rub. The figures we've pulled out today, we've got the known unknowns. My colleague Ross brought some of those out, but we've got the unknown unknowns, of which none of us have a clue over it. Plus, the point you make, if this bill were to go through and become a success, the figures could be quite startling in terms of the increased provision that be required therein. So my next question to you is, this committee is very vexed, and indeed that includes the Conservative members, around fiscal sustainability. How do you think that this unknown unknowns and known unknowns will factor into the fiscal sustainability of Scotland's public finances if it were to go through? What reflection have you given to that?
Well, I now know how the press team felt when Dom Rumsfeld was speaking about his known unknowns and such like all those years ago. It is a challenge I have wrestled with throughout this. And when I first saw the outcome of the financial memorandum, I expected it to be higher. No doubt about it. And I actually think I might have had an easier time at committee if it had been significantly higher, because the respondents are very clear. They think it is an underestimation of the amount of money to go forward. But I cannot back that up. We looked at other methodology in terms of coming up with the figures in the financial memorandum, and they all had significant pitfalls that were going to meet with the same problems that you are discussing here today. In terms of fiscal responsibility, I go back to Dame Carol Black, that yes, we may end up spending more than £198 million on this issue. We will end up saving more lives, and we will also end up saving more for the public service generally by the savings that she has identified. £1 in intervention gets you £4 back elsewhere in the system.
The question was actually about fiscal sustainability.
Sorry.
And we have an issue. We have a number of benefits here in Scotland that this committee has brought up that are committed to. They're demand-led, in other words, and they're committed to. And what we're seeing is that the draw on those benefits is increasing against a backdrop of a fixed budget. And that is the terminology we're using around fiscal sustainability. This would be exactly the same thing, because it would be enshrined in law. And the next thing, we potentially would have the Scottish Fiscal Commission saying, well, as a result in some parts of potentially the bill's success and more people coming forward, we've got a very steep curve alongside social security benefits that would greatly affect our fiscal sustainability. And I think it was the convener in his opening remarks talked about we cannot predict the timescales by when the £1, £4 will kick in. We can't do that. So we could potentially be setting ourselves on target for, well, massive cuts in other areas because we can't break the law because of the fixed budget position. So I suppose that's the point I wanted to bring out. But one other thing, having looked at the 95 points, which I have to say are very, very good, I was then quite surprised at the low bandwidth between the year one costs of low and year one costs of high. They're relatively narrow. I would have expected them, given the 95 points, to be considerably higher. Well, what was the thinking
again,
behind that?
That's based on trying to determine if it would be 50% or 2/3. So that band is actually quite limited, going back to the answers I hopefully gave to Mr Mason.
Right.
That would be my answer to that point.
Okay, I get your point. My other question was, have you done any research, and you may well have done and I've missed it, into other countries that have done this, taken a legislative approach rather than a principled, for example, human rights approach? Has any other country done this?
Well, I've looked at it for Scotland, because Scotland has the biggest problem in the United Kingdom and across Europe. In terms of going down the legislative route, and I know from discussions with Ms Smith's bill in my own committee, some people are concerned about putting things into a statutory footing and into legislation rather than just allowing the processes to take their own course. The fact is these processes are not working. The fact is we have people who are told that treatment is the right option for them, and they are not able to get it. They're not able to get it because of availability, they're not able to get it because of costs, they're not able to get it for a number of different reasons.
But my question was, are you aware of any other country that have enshrined this in legislation as compared to taking a principled approach? I mean, I'm not aware of, but then, you're obviously very well across this. Is there any other country enshrined this in legislation in the manner in which you propose?
So with that caveat, in the manner that we are proposing here, no, is my understanding. We have looked at that, and we also always look...
What do you think the reason for that is?
Well, I was going to say we always look for international comparisons, but potentially the reason is they don't have Scotland's shocking drug and alcohol death rates, and the fact that we are the worst in the United Kingdom and across Europe means we have to do something different here. And that's why I think it is incumbent on this Parliament to look at outside the box. As I said to Mr Mason, if we continue to do the same time and time again, we shouldn't be surprised if the results in terms of people dying remain the same. We have to look at something different, which is why I think this unique approach to Scotland is right.
And if this doesn't go through as you intend, what is your plan B?
Well, I have to say, learned a lot from Ms Smith's bill and the discussions that Mr Greer and Mr Mason and I have had on our committee, because I think it is important that we look at alternatives. To go back to Mr Hoy's point, I think first of all the bill has continued to raise awareness of this issue. We have seen the submissions that you've received and the Health and Sport Committee have received that shine a light on a number of these areas. I also said in my opening remarks that I think what we've come up with, and I specifically mentioned the Non-Government Bills Unit and Stephen Wishart and Anne-Marie Ward and myself, is very good. And I like the fact that the Cabinet Secretary in his response to your letter said he in his letter in response to your call for evidence, agrees with the intended outcomes of this bill. But I'm also willing to look at and accept any amendments that come forward. And ultimately, I don't want to say I would accept far less than is in this bill, because that then allows ministers and others to aim for that far less rather than the bill, which I think is crucial. But ultimately, we need to see more availability in rehab beds, in forms of treatment that can help and support people with addiction issues. And that will require further commitments from the government. And that's why we've put an increased budget on this. And I think the government need to continue to prioritise this area and back it up with the funding that is required.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's exhausted questions from members of the committee, but I still have one or two others. I mean, one of the things that John was talking about was the issue of the 38 million, but I think the concern is it's not about the policy issue at all. It's about whether this 38 million is accurate. So it's about whether it's not about, where would you find this 38 million? Really, it's about, is the 38 million the right figure, or even 28 million, which is in here now? The Scottish Ambulance, even if it was, the Scottish Ambulance Service has said at a time of economic downturn with current budget cuts and constraints, it's challenging to imagine how the cost of providing what is outlined in the bill could be achieved, not to mention the ability to develop the associated workforce and infrastructure. COSL has said, whilst we agree there will be significant initial costs, we don't agree there will be a flattening and declining costs in the medium to longer term, and that's notwithstanding they have access to the same Dame Carol Black report that you have. Alcohol Focus Scotland has said estimates for additional investment in services contained in the financial memorandum to deliver the aims of the bill fall short of what is required to ensure equitable access to all of those requiring support. Now, you've talked about the fact that you've used the databases available to come up with this 38 million figure, but one of the things that's come through in the evidence we've received is that there's been an underestimation in ongoing support and capital support. Now, I'll just say one other thing here, and this is obviously from the Aberdeen City Alcohol and Drug Partnership, as you touched on yourself, and they've said the bill uses baseline figures and assumes those figures can all be attributed to a proposed narrow definition of substance use treatment with a clinical diagnosis. In reality, the current pot of resource available will also go into a wider range of activity, drug education, children and family services, justice services, a huge range of third sector services, injecting equipment provision, harm reduction, justice services, consumables, medicines, travel, administration and other indirect costs such as recruitment and training. To achieve the proposal of all existing funding going into a defined list of treatments, there would be huge reductions in cross-system activity and a significant impact on indirect costs. Now, this committee, we took evidence on the National Care Service Bill, and as you know, we were unhappy with the financial memorandum, and they went back and came back with another financial memorandum. We also we weren't happy with the police ethics financial memorandum because it wasn't the most up-to-date that it could have been, and we had the Cabinet Secretary come back. Now, given the kind of issues that have been raised here from the witnesses, the submissions that we've received, and given the fact, that there appears to be an underestimation in ongoing costs, capital, etc. And in fact, you yourself said the financial memorandum was prepared before ensuring employers' national insurance contributions were perceived, if you like. Do you think there's an argument to go back and revisit the financial memorandum?
Well, it depends if it also means I have another 90 minutes in front of your committee convener, because I might not be willing to take it into. I say that in jest.
Very fair. I've been very open.
I say it in jest. I think there are definitely things that have come out since the bill was lodged, since the financial memorandum was written. Indeed, Audit Scotland, who I mentioned, their 2022 report. There has been the 2024 report, came out after the financial memorandum was submitted. So I am very happy to go away as instructed or otherwise by this committee to look at some of the areas that have materialised since the financial memorandum was submitted, to look at some of the updated issues and challenges that are facing both the sector and other bodies who have made very compelling submissions to your committee. I would, however, repeat that a lot of the concerns they have are wider funding issues that come down to the challenges for local and national government and also the changing circumstances, as you said, with UK decisions as well.
I mean, I think it would be very helpful to you and indeed to get this actual bill through. I mean, I'm not going to go through the further comments have been made to Aberdeen City Partnership, but you'll know that they've raised a number of concerns with regard to long-term availability of substances, housing, employment, deprivation as well. So I think if those could be looked at, I think you could come back with something a lot more robust. It would be very, very helpful. And I would say, just finally, in terms of the Dame Carol Black's comments, preventative spend, which there's an argument that this is. It's something we have wrestled with on a predecessor committee since 2011, and it's an absolute nightmare. Whenever we're trying to look at the budget for the forthcoming year, or even slightly further ahead, the number of organisations who come to us and say, if you just spend X amount this year, we can save you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times more in some indeterminate period ahead. I think if more could be done to pin down the sort of savings over a specific time period, that would also be very helpful. But in saying that, I think that this has been a very worthwhile session, and I appreciate the responses that we've actually received as a committee.
Well, can I also say that this is the first appearance in committee for this bill. I think it's been useful to tease out some of the financial issues, the data issues at this point. I'm sure they will also be considered by the lead committee, and I take on board the point points that members have raised and seek to come back to you with that additional information.
Okay, two further things. I just want to ask if you have any further points you feel we've not covered that you want to make. And secondly...
Sorry, just there was one point that I thought I would have got in before. On residential rehab beds, it was a commitment of a former First Minister as well to increase the treatments offered residential rehab from 5% to 11%. And 11% is included because that's the European average. So again, it's looking to get our figures up. It's in the financial memorandum at paragraph 35, and I think it is important to get that point on record that this is seeking to get us up to levels that are experienced elsewhere in Europe. Indeed,
that was Nicola Sturgeon, I recall. And the only other final point I want to make was that I neglect to give the apologies of Michael Mara, which is probably why the record will wonder why he's been so silent this morning. So I belatedly give his apologies. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will move on to agenda item 2 soon, but I'll just call a 5-minute break in the meantime. Thank you. Ready? Okay. Good. The next item on our agenda today is an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance and the Scottish Landfill Tax Standard Rate and Lower Rate Order 2025. The Minister is joined today by Jonathan Waite, Aggregates Tax Bill Team Leader, Scottish Government. I welcome you both to the meeting and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, the Scottish Landfill Tax Standard Rate and Lower Rate Order 2025 specifies the standard and lower rates for Scottish landfill tax, which would apply from 1st April 2025. These are consistent with the rates set out in the Scottish Budget 2025-26, published on the 4th of December last year. The order sets out that the standard rate will increase from £103.70 per tonne to £126.15 per tonne, and the lower rate for less polluting inert materials will increase from £3.30 per tonne to £4.05 per tonne. Committee members may wish to note that these rates match the rate for UK landfill tax rates for the financial year 25-26, as confirmed in the October 2024 UK budget. The Scottish Government has continued to act to avoid any potential for what is referred to as waste tourism to emerge as a result of material differences between tax rates north and south of the border. The increased rates are intended to provide appropriate financial incentives to support delivery of the Scottish Government's circular economy, climate and sustainable resource goals. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the opening statement. Do you really think, that if you were to put the tax on inert waste up by £1, you'd have vast numbers of lorries charging over the border in order to avoid tax, given what it costs actually to ship such material, everything from the fuel to what you have to pay the driver and the depreciation on the lorry? I mean, it's kind of a nonsense, isn't it? I mean, I can understand it, on the non-inert waste, but just seems a bit bizarre that this has been devolved for umpteen years and there's never been a penny differential, and we still get this ludicrous, statement every year about waste tourism on that inert waste. I mean, surely we can think up our own tax on that. I mean, if it was a fiver, it would make an extra few bob for the Scottish Government, and there wouldn't be a queue of trucks at Berwick, trying to dump their waste in Northumberland.
Absolutely. I take the point you're making, Convener. My understanding is that the Welsh have done that and they've increased the tax rate for on the lower rate to £6.30. I think
they've always been bolder than us, to be fair.
Yeah. I think that's something we'll look and see how that operates, because if there were potential for waste tourism, that would clearly be geographically easier from Wales into England and Scotland to England. We'll see how that works and take a sense of that and consider that for our deliberations for the tax for next year.
Okay, thank you. Ross?
Just on exactly that note, Minister, I mean, we've had the landfill tax for a while now, so is Wales and England. Why has the Scottish Government not looked into the potential of a differential rate before this point?
I think it's always been, the principle's been round about that waste tourism, if you want to call it that, and not wanting to get an environment where that was something we'd to be concerned about. Clearly, the whole intention is to drive behavioural change through that and other policy measures. And if you look at the trends, then clearly it's moving in a downward direction, both inert and non-inert. So it's having that, which is the primary policy intention. But as I say, I think there is scope for us to have a look at what differentials would do. Do some assessment of how much additional it would raise, but as I say, in the context of the revenue raised reducing significantly anyway as a consequence of the behavioural change that it's driving, then I'm not sure that any increase in that regard would make a significant difference.
I certainly welcome that additional work happening. I mean, it seems that the single deciding factor in setting the rate in Scotland is what the rate is in England, but we have our own climate targets, we have our own waste reduction targets. What regard has been given to whether setting the landfill tax rate at an equivalent to the English rate will have on the targets we've set in Scotland. Because on all these targets, climate emissions, waste reduction, circular economy, etc., our targets are either more ambitious than England's, or we have targets in areas that they simply do not have. It seems there's a dichotomy here, because this is one of the key drivers for meeting these targets. The rate we set it at doesn't seem to be based on what we would need to do to hit those targets. It's based, it seems, entirely on what the UK government set the rate at in England.
Yeah, and I think you need to have evidence that say doing something differently. There was some evidential base to do that, and I suppose you're working in probably in 3 dimensions here, because you're looking at how much money, as Convener said, would an increase raise. And I'm just looking at the data here. The if I'm correct, officials are correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like there's about 110,000 tonnes on the lower rate, so that would a £1 increase there would bring in an extra £100,000, right? So yeah, it's welcome, but it's not going to shift the dial on the budget. So there's that aspect of it. There's then, if you start to increase that rate by too much and the differential does grow, then is there the potential for that waste tourism, which is the last thing we want, because that makes everything more difficult. And then what are the rates at the moment doing in terms of driving behavioural change? And with those numbers coming down year on year, it looks like they're having the intended policy impact of driving that behavioural change. But as I say, I'm very happy to look at the evidence we've got and do some modelling as best we can with the information we have got to see what making some changes there in future years might deliver.
I would certainly welcome that. I understand entirely the risk of waste tourism. None of us want to see it. My concern is just that, as is so often the case, we are not hitting our targets that have been set in legislation by this Parliament in relation to emission reduction, waste reduction, recycling, etc. And it seems that one of our key levers is not based on the targets set by this Parliament. It's based on a very risk-averse approach, a very risk-averse response to what the UK government's policy making is for England. So I would certainly welcome that work being done ahead of the next budget. Okay.
Sorry, I've just noticed in my notes here, Convener, just to correct that. It was about 600,000 tonnes at the lower rate. It was 110,000 tonnes, and that was soil. There's other material in there as well. So it is a more significant, but as I say, in the big scheme of things, it's not.
So if it's 600,000 tonnes and you put it up by a fiver, that'd be £3 million revenue addition for the Scottish Government, because folk aren't going to drive from Motherwell or Aberdeen across the border to save a fiver a tonne. They just aren't, you know. So it seems to me sensible to be somewhat bolder in this, and I would hope that the Government will look at that
indeed we shall.
Next year. Yeah. Okay. Any further questions from any colleagues? No one else has got any further questions they want to make. So we now turn to agenda item 3, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S6M 16546 that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Scottish Landfill Tax Standard Rate and Lower Rate Order 2025 SSI 2025/41 be approved.
Moved.
Do any members wish to speak? No members have indicated that they wish to speak. I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M at 16546 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. We'll publish a short report to the Parliament setting out a decision and then submit following today's meeting. We'll now pause briefly to allow for a change of officials before moving to our next item on the agenda. The next item on our agenda today is to take evidence again from the Minister for Public Finance, this time on the Public Services Reform Scotland Act 2010, Part 2 Extension Order 2025. The Minister is joined by Angus MacLeod, Head of Public Bodies Support Unit, Scottish Government. I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. Public service reform is a huge challenge, but a proper and appropriate use of the correct levers can directly support the Government's priority of delivering effective and sustainable public services, and strong public services are in turn better placed to deliver our key priorities of growing the economy, eradicating child poverty and tackling the climate crisis. The powers contained in this order are one such lever. They offer important tools to drive public service reform. They can be used to adjust the configuration of the public body's landscape to release funds for frontline services and better meet future needs. And in some cases, they can also be used to unlock barriers to reform. At a time when resources are stretched and demands on public services are increasing, public sector bodies need to ensure that services remain affordable and sustainable longer term, while continuing to support better outcomes for people across Scotland. In many cases, that will require reform and changes to the way public sector bodies operate. These order-making powers will enable small-scale changes to be made in a more proportionate and flexible way than would be possible if we had to find a place in the parliamentary legislative programme to take forward primary legislation. I'll stress that the use of these orders is restricted in two situations. Firstly, to improve the effectiveness, efficiency and economy of public service functions, an example being the establishment of the Poverty and Inequality Commission as a statutory public body. And secondly, to reduce or remove burdens on any public sector or private sector organisation. And that section has been used to reduce burdens on businesses. For example, orders have amended requirements relating to agricultural tenancies and streamlining and simplifying the planning system. These powers are subject to safeguards in the 2010 Act, where any proposed changes to primary legislation through the order-making powers are subject to a rigorous examination and scrutiny, and a strict super-affirmative procedure applies to any order made using these powers. The responsibility remains with public bodies to address and try to resolve any issues by other means before turning to the order-making powers. Regarding the public consultation on these powers, that was live from 16th of December last year to 10th of February this year. We received 21 responses, mainly from organisations. 16 responses agreed to extending these powers by a further 5 years. 4 opposed the extension and 1 was neutral. The reasons given in favour included supporting more effective and efficient operations and the flexibility to effect change, and a small number of responses opposing the extension were mainly focused on the potential for abuse of the powers or potential for government to reduce the authority of public bodies. And I believe that these are addressed by the safeguards in place in the 2010 Act. I would conclude, convener, by reminding the committee that unless Parliament renews these order-making powers every 5 years, they are lost forever. Parliament last renewed these powers in June 2020, so they must be signed off by Parliament by the 2nd of May this year if they are to continue from June 2025. And I look forward to answering any questions on this matter.
No, so lost forever, so no pressure on the committee then, you're saying, right? Well, one of the things it basically says in your policy objectives is that it delivers more streamlined and it's more streamlined and flexible than primary legislation. But I'm just wondering if the Scottish Government has actually looked or considered at any point trying to make the process of primary legislation more streamlined and flexible.
That is a good question. It's a question I'm sure my colleague, the Minister for Parliamentary Business, would be delighted to come in front of the committee and comment on. But what I would say is that we are always striving to make processes within government more effective and efficient. And any thoughts on how we can do that in the legislative process, I'm sure would be very welcome.
Now, interesting, when I look at Section 3, there's a thing called Ministerial Salary Sacrifice, and you look reasonably comfortable despite your hair shirt today, Minister. You'll be glad to know that the committee did have a whip round for you actually before you arrived this morning, given this 15-year volunteer, and I put volunteer in inverted commas, freeze on ministerial salary, and it says there is no intention of actually changing this. So, I mean, it's hard to see how, in my view, the public will continue to value the work of ministers if they don't seem to value it themselves.
That is a matter for the First Minister, and I wouldn't want to say any more on that.
So when it comes to the Conveners Committee in a week or two, you're suggesting that this is maybe something I should put directly to him?
I wouldn't want to make any such suggestions, but I'm sure the committee will make its own mind up on what matters it wants to put forward.
Okay.
But what I would say is, I mean, it's genuinely a privilege to serve as a minister in the Scottish Government, regardless of any issues around about salary sacrifice.
And yeah, okay. Indeed. Okay, Liz?
Thank you. Minister, I don't have any issues with the orders that you set out. It does, however, raise issues that we've been wrestling with in this committee for a long time, and also the predecessor committee, the Finance and Constitution Committee, previous Parliament, was doing exactly the same, that when it comes to measuring public sector reform, I think we're all struggling to get a handle on what the criteria are to do that. And I've heard you say in the Chamber several times, and Shona Robertson say in the Chamber several times, that there is quite a lot of improvement in the efficiency of public services. It's not easy to see that, and I think you probably would agree with that, Minister. Do you have any way of helping this committee about what criteria we should be looking for to see just how well we are advancing with public sector reform?
That's a good question. And I think because it's a complex system, it's not simply a measure of one policy intervention makes one difference that you can then measure. We talked earlier about the landfill tax, and there you've got a much cleaner line of sight between we make an intervention, we can see the behavioural change, we can see the tax numbers, we can see how that flows through on the more general policy ambition. Clearly, by the nature of public service reform, you've got many, many interlocking bodies, policies and objectives at different levels. But what I would say is that clearly there's a measure round about the amount of money we can demonstratively save by driving more efficiency across the system. So I think that's one hard measure, and we're focused on measuring that. I think there are then measures in terms of what you might call the top line or the ultimate measures of the government's agenda in terms of poverty, reducing poverty, growing the economy, and tackling the climate crisis, where we have got top-line measures. But as I said, there are clearly many, many different policy objectives that drive into those, that can influence those. So I suppose it's a question of looking for more intermediate measures, many of which are covered in the National Performance Framework. But again, the clear line of sight, there'll be many policies and many bodies impacting that. In some places it's clearer, for example, in the health service in terms of throughput of a number of operations or procedures carried out and so on and so forth. In other areas it's more of a lengthy process before you get feedback in terms of policy interventions. In other aspects, it's probably more easy to measure in terms of productivity within Social Security Scotland, for example. So I think there's a whole range of different measures, and I think we are very open to being able to quantify some of those if it helps the committee and ourselves understand.
I think Minister, I think it's a big question actually, because obviously we're responsible for scrutinising public money. And if there are aspects of public sector reform that are working particularly well in terms of saving public money and able to deliver better outcomes, that's very important to this Parliament, it's very important to this committee to be able to demonstrate that. And I'm just interested in your views of how Scottish ministers can provide, or civil servants can provide, some of the data that we need just to scrutinise that a bit more effectively. Because if we could do that, I think it could go a long way to improving how this Parliament works, but also to giving the public some confidence that public sector reform is working.
And if you take those kind of harder efficiency measures, we published data last year and we'll be updating it this year in terms of what public bodies spend on the back office costs. So that gives us numbers on the total spend on estates, on the public sector, on maintenance of those estates, on what is spent on procurement, what is spent on corporate finance or HR functions and so on. So that data is now available for the first time across the whole of the public body landscape. And then in parallel with that, we've got data that we publish on a regular basis around about how much money we're saving in terms of the estates, and that number is about £36 million.
So when's that data?
It's already available. That was published last November.
You said there was an update coming.
Oh, we're working on that now. So we're going back out to public bodies at the moment to get data from them for their 25-26 budget. So we're working with public sector leaders to understand the best time to do that. But that'll be in the next few weeks. We'll go out for the next trawl of data, and it'll be published later towards the middle of this year. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then what we're trying to establish, because firstly we did it last year on historical data. We're now doing it on trying to get doing it on budgeted data, so we're getting ahead of that curve, and then we'll establish a process that's efficient. But what we don't want to do is put another big load on public bodies of collecting data that's not going to be. So there's that piece. We will update that. But so that 22-23 data is available, and as I say, the savings that we've delivered on estates, on procurement, on other aspects of the hard savings are there already.
I think, Convener, that might be something that we want to scrutinise when
yes,
it is.
Why not?
Very good.
That's something we should look
Welcome
at.
that.
Craig?
Thanks, Convener. Just to perhaps kind of follow in similar vein to Liz Smith, obviously the Act that we're looking at dates from 2010, so this is the third extension to it. I suppose just to give some assurance, and I accept that we need to do something as having something. Some process is better than no process, but just to convince us that this isn't just a holy grail, that we're going to keep renewing it and see no material change. In 2011, the Christie Commission, Christie report said that it was estimated that as much as 40% of all public expenditure on public services is accounted for by interventions that could have been avoided by prioritising a preventative approach. Obviously, you're now talking again about the need for a preventative approach. Obviously, Christie came to that estimate of 40% back in 2011. That report was commissioned by John Smithy. Roll forward 14 years. Would you have any basis to try and assess what that percentage is now? Have you made any impact positively in relation to that?
I mean, well, first thing I would say is it'd probably be difficult to do a true like for like, in the sense of clearly a lot of things will have changed in terms of the nature of public services that we're providing, how we provide them, etc., etc. So I think that would be a difficult comparison, because you're not comparing the world as it is now with what it was back then in terms of the range and nature of public services we provide, or indeed the demand on them. But what I would say is that I'm very happy to go and look and assess the process that was going through to arrive at that 40% number, and see if there's any way that we can update that, and if that's something we can do. I think, I remember the exact wording in Christie. It was referring to a previous piece of work that was done, I can't recall by who, and it said up to 40% was, I think, the terminology they used. So I don't think it's a hard and fast number, but it certainly gives an indication of the scale of the opportunity that's there.
I think, given we're back talking about preventative spending, and it probably would be quite good to see on what basis it was assessed and whether or not any progress has been made. But so jump forward to last autumn. Obviously, Audit Scotland took up a similar kind of position where they said that there's still no evidence of large-scale change on the ground, and that the government, just, and to quote them, does not know what additional funding is required to support reform. Obviously, you've put 30 million in the budget this year for Invest to Save. Can you give the Auditor General, I suppose, some assurance that you're working towards getting an actual figure that you're going to work towards in terms of using that to leverage the reforms that ultimately might meet the initial objectives of this Act?
Well, there's a number of things happening there. The Invest to Save Fund is one lever. I mean, these orders are another lever. There are other levers we've got ongoing. We've talked about the States programme, the procurement frameworks and digitisation, the automation programme that saved a significant amount of money already, and those programmes continue. The Invest to Save Fund is targeted specifically at some of these harder to crack challenges where we've got cross-portfolio cooperation required, and we've got improvements that may take a period of time to generate savings. So in answer to your question directly on Invest to Save, that process is opened. We have already received the first trawl back of those submissions. Officials are looking at those just now. I'll see those in the next week or two, and then before the end of this month, we'll obviously be identifying the projects that we're taking forward with regard to investment, that 30 million. Now, those projects will identify how much investment they want and what savings they'll deliver as a consequence of that, in what timescale. So as we select those projects and we aggregate them, we'll be able to answer the question directly and then be able to monitor that to see how it delivers.
Just lastly, I think the Auditor General said in that same report that the government had not provided enough leadership to help public sector bodies deliver change. You've obviously had the summit recently. You are leading the charge. So is it your neck that's on the line here in relation to finally delivering on this Holy Grail?
Well, in terms of providing the leadership, absolutely. Yeah. You've got to recognise that, and this is an excuse, it's just the reality. Public bodies aren't wholly owned subsidiaries of ministers. They're operational independent to varying degrees. So yeah, while we control the amount of funding that we allocate to them, the effectiveness with which they adopt efficiency measures frankly can be variable. So that's why it's really important that we continue to work with public sector leaders. The governance board that will have its first meeting by the end of this month will contain public sector leaders and some private sector experienced individuals as well with experience in this area. We are seeking to roll out more measures for monitoring round about workforce and recruitment within public bodies. We continue to collect more data on how public bodies choose to spend the money that the Scottish Government allocates to them. And all of that is about moving us in the right direction of having better data, more coherent policy and strategy around about this, more engagement and frankly more empowerment of public body leaders to be able to work together to seize these opportunities.
And just finally, sorry,
Yeah.
Convener,
Sure.
you obviously identified in relation to health boards and councils the concept of the single authority model.
Yes.
Perhaps is that a lesson you should roll through government more widely, given that you say that it's actually quite difficult for you as the Minister in charge to drive reform? Do you need to look at the coherence and the number of all these bodies that are out there?
Well, yeah, the number of bodies is one thing. I think if that was your only objective, in terms of talking about earlier about objectives, you could kind of miss the point there. We'd consolidate public bodies where it makes sense to do so. And we've started some work to look at portfolio by portfolio, the number of public bodies in each portfolio, and whether there is scope for them to certainly work more closely together in clusters, and that is something we've organically been creating already, and some of those are moving further along that road than others in terms of how they share resources. But yeah, where there is a clear case to be made that consolidation of public bodies makes sense because it's going to deliver a cost-effective solution that delivers better services, then absolutely. That is very much on the cards as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, we talked about zero-based budgeting in this committee after our visit to Estonia, where they're actually doing that at departmental level in their government. And of course, it's done quite a lot in many areas of the private sector. But is that a kind of approach that might be taken to some of these public bodies? Because some of them are there because it seems they've always been there. Whereas if you look at it from the very, what is their core activity that they need to do, and do they have to be that organisation to deliver that? I mean, is that another way that could be looked at, for example, in terms of public bodies?
Oh, no, absolutely. I think with zero-based budgeting, we need to be careful what we actually mean there. I mean,
indeed.
If I kind of flip that, one of the big criticisms rightly we get from third sector and many other organisations is we don't have multi-year funding, right? And that effectively is zero-based budget, and we go back every year with a blank piece of paper and decide who's going to get the money. So we're arguing to roll that uncertainty out more widely across the public sector. It could cause more challenges than it solves problems. So we just need to be careful what we mean by zero-based budgeting. But having said that, yeah, this is about taking a step back and saying what is the purpose and what are the deliverables of a group of public bodies in any particular part of the landscape, and then is the configuration that's there the most effective way of doing that, and then should we do it differently? And effectively you would at that point start with a blank piece of paper and consider the bodies that are in that space and say, if we started with what's the minimum number of bodies you would need to deliver on that, and is it cost effective to make that transformation?
And that approach doesn't have to be done every year. I mean, if you've got an organisation that's been going for decades, it'd be a useful.
Yeah. That should be a multi-year because it would take, by its nature, a period, and it's not something you need to do wholesale. It's something you would do. You'd frankly look for the low-hanging fruit. And to be honest, we've done some of that. And if you look at what we've done on the police, if you look at what we've done on colleges, and there's other examples, minor examples cited in here where bodies' functions have been brought together. We would always seek to look for ways to continue to do that.
Thank you. Incidentally, while we've been having this discussion, just to jump back a wee bit, the £490,000 that will be saved by ministerial sacrifice in the next financial year is less than putting £1 on your inert 600,000 tonnes of inert waste for a year, just to get that perspective for you.
I'll try to get my head around that one. Thank you.
We now turn to agenda item 5, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S6M 16547 that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Public Services Reform Scotland Act 2010 Part 2 Further Extension Order 2025 draft be approved.
Formally moved.
Do any members wish to speak? No members have indicated that they wish to speak. So I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M 16547 we agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. So I'd like to thank you for your evidence this morning, Minister, and also your official, Mr MacLeod. We'll publish a short report to the Parliament setting out a decision on the draft instrument. And as that concludes the public part of today's meeting, we now move into private session.